Pam Bondi sat before the grand piano, her fingers poised above the keys, the weight of the world pressing against her shoulders. The political arena had long been her battlefield, a place where words were her weapons and strategy her armor. But tonight, there were no debates, no accusations, no deflections, only music. The dimly lit concert hall was packed with an audience that had gathered out of curiosity as much as admiration. Many had come expecting a spectacle, a gimmick, a public figure seeking attention. What they received instead was something altogether different. As she pressed the first key, a soft yet commanding note filled the room, reverberating through the silence, like a declaration of intent. Then, as if the floodgates had opened, her fingers danced across the ivory keys, weaving a melody that spoke of passion, pain, resilience, and triumph. The piece she had chosen was Chopin's Ballade No. B1, a composition known for its complexity and emotional depth. It was not an easy choice, nor a safe one, but Pam Bondi had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Each note told a story, carrying echoes of late nights spent in solitude, practicing in secret, perfecting each movement with relentless determination. Few knew of her lifelong love for the piano, a love that had remained in the shadows while the world saw only the prosecutor, the politician, the advocate. Now, that hidden part of her was finally being revealed. The audience sat spellbound, their skepticism melting away with each crescendo and decrescendo. The critics who had come ready to scoff found themselves leaning forward, drawn in against their will. The melody swelled, a surge of raw emotion filling the space, demanding to be heard, felt, understood. It was a performance that transcended politics, that stripped away titles and labels, leaving only the purity of artistry. As the final notes rang out, a hush fell over the hall, a silence thick with the weight of what had just transpired. And then, like the slow build of a storm, the applause erupted. It was not polite clapping, not the obligatory appreciation, often extended to public figures attempting something outside their usual domain. It was genuine, thunderous, an undeniable acknowledgement of mastery. Pam Bondi stood, her hands resting at her sides, her heart pounding. She had not played to prove a point. She had not played for validation. She had played because the music was a part of her, because it spoke when words could not. And in that moment, the applause was not for the prosecutor, the politician, or the public figure. It was for the artist. The critics were silent. She took a slow breath, allowing the energy of the moment to settle within her. She had faced countless battles in courtrooms, had stood firm against scrutiny, and had navigated the relentless waves of public opinion, but nothing had ever felt quite like this here. Under the soft glow of the stage lights, she was not arguing a case, not defending a position. She was simply expressing a truth that had lived within her long before she had stepped into the public eye. Music had always been her sanctuary, a refuge from the noise of the world, a place where words were unnecessary, where emotion could flow, unfiltered, unrestrained. She had learned to play as a child, her small fingers stretching across the keys, struggling at first to make sense of the notes before her. But with time and patience, she had discovered the language of music had found within it a voice more powerful than any speech she had ever delivered. Politics had claimed, her attention had shaped her path, but music had never left her. It had waited patiently in the background, a constant presence, a quiet solace now as she stood. Before an audience that had come expecting something else entirely, she felt the weight of their expectations shift. They had come with preconceived notions ready to judge. Yet what they had witnessed was beyond their predictions. She could see it. In their eyes. In the way some sat motionless, as if afraid to disturb the lingering resonance of the final notes. She could hear it in the murmurs that rippled through the crowd, a mixture of astonishment and admiration. She had not played for applause, had not performed for the sake of proving a point, and yet the realization settled upon her with undeniable clarity. This moment had redefined her. In their eyes, she was no longer just the public figure, the lawyer, the advocate. She was an artist, a musician, someone who had bared a part of her soul on that stage, and in doing so had reached them in a way no speech ever could, as the applause swelled around her, growing louder, more insistent. She inclined her head in a quiet acknowledgement. Then, without another word, she turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a room full of people who would never see her the same way again. Backstage, the echoes of the applause still vibrated through her skin, her breath steady yet deep, as she processed the moment she had expected reaction. But not this. Not the raw, undeniable energy that had filled the concert hall. Not the way the audience had remained silent for that brief moment before erupting into something that felt almost like reverence. She walked slowly down the narrow corridor, the cool air brushing against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the stage. She had been under bright lights before, but never in this way. Never with her soul laid bare in melodies. Instead of words, a stagehand offered her a small nod of admiration, as she passed a quiet recognition of what had just occurred. She could still feel the weight of the keys beneath her fingertips, still hear the lingering echoes of the final note ringing in her mind. It had been years since she had allowed herself this moment. Years since she had let the music take center stage instead of the courtroom or the press conference, and yet tonight it had felt as though she had never left, as if the years had folded in on themselves and brought her back to the pure, unfiltered joy of creating. She found herself in the dressing room now, the faint hum of conversation from the concert hall still filtering through the walls. She leaned against the counter, staring at her reflection in the mirror. For a long moment, the woman staring back at her was the same, and yet somehow different. The same sharp eyes, the same determined expression, but softened now as if something long locked away had finally been released. There was a knock at the door, a hesitant one, not the commanding rap of a political aide or a journalist eager for a statement. She turned, opening it to find an older man standing there, his eyes shining with something she could only describe as deep-seated emotion. He looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking. "I came here expecting a curiosity," he admitted. "I left having witnessed something extraordinary." She nodded, accepting the words but saying nothing, because what could be said that the music had not already conveyed? He continued, "You reminded me tonight of why music matters, of why it reaches places within us that nothing else can. I don't know if you realize what you've done out there, but you've left people changed tonight." She exhaled slowly, a small nod of gratitude passing between them as he turned and disappeared into the hallway, leaving her with the quiet realization that tonight had not just been about playing the piano. It had been about revealing a truth about herself, one that had been buried beneath layers of duty and expectation. And now, as she sat down, in the silence of her dressing room, fingers still tingling from the intensity of the performance, she knew one thing with certainty: this would not be the last time the world heard her play. She sat there for a long moment, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wooden surface of the dressing table, the distant murmur of the audience still filtering through the walls, the echoes of her performance lingering in her mind. She could feel it deep within her chest, the way the music had spoken, in ways that words never could, the way it had stripped away every label, every expectation, and left only the raw, unfiltered truth of who she was. She had spent years in a world where perception was everything, where strength was measured in arguments, won in political battles fought, and yet here in this quiet room, after the storm of applause had faded, she felt a different kind of strength, one that came not from defiance or strategy, but from surrender, from allowing herself to be seen not as a prosecutor or a politician, but as an artist, a musician, a storyteller in her own right. The door creaked open slightly and she turned, expecting an assistant, a stagehand perhaps, but instead she found herself face to face with a young woman. No, older than 20, her eyes wide with something between admiration and uncertainty. She hesitated, as if unsure whether she should speak, But then she did, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say your performance tonight, it was breathtaking. I've never seen anything like it." Pam studied her for a moment, noting the way she clutched a small program in her hands. Fingers curled tightly around the edges as if holding on to something fragile, something important. "Thank you," she said simply. But the girl shook her head, as if those words were not enough. "No, you don't understand. I've been playing piano since I was a child. But somewhere along the way, it just became another obligation. Another thing I had to do instead of something. I loved watching you tonight. It reminded me why I started in the first place. It made me feel something real again." Pam felt something stir deep within her, a quiet recognition, a reflection of a younger version of herself before the weight of expectation, before the world had told her who she was supposed to be. "What's your name?" she asked softly. The girl hesitated, then answered, "Emma." "Well, Emma," she said, leaning forward slightly, her gaze steady. "If tonight reminded you why you love music, then don't let that feeling go. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter where life takes you, always hold on to that." Emma nodded, her grip on the program loosening slightly as if the words had settled. Something within her, she stepped back, giving Pam one last lingering look before disappearing into the hallway, leaving Pam alone once more. But this time it was a different kind of solitude. Not the loneliness of suppressing a part of herself, but the quiet contentment of knowing she had let it be seen. She exhaled slowly, turning back to the mirror, her reflection meeting her gaze with something new, something lighter. She knew tomorrow the headlines would come, the analysis, the speculation, about what her performance meant, about why she had chosen this moment to reveal this side of herself. But none of that mattered, because tonight had not been for them. It had not been for politics or publicity. It had been for the music, for the truth. It carried for the way it had reached people in ways she had never anticipated. She reached out, her fingers grazing the cool surface of the mirror. A silent promise to herself that she would not let this part of her fade again. Then, with one last glance, she stood, gathering her things and stepping out into the night, where the world still waited, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to meet it as her whole self. As Pam stepped out into the cool night air, the crisp breeze kissed, her skin carrying with it the distant hum of the city beyond the theater. The world outside had continued as it always did. Cars passing streetlights, flickering conversations, weaving through the fabric of the evening. But within her, something had shifted, something irreversible. She had walked onto that stage as one version of herself, and walked off as another. Not because she had changed, but because for the first time in a long time, she had let the world see her as she truly was. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she made her way toward the car, waiting by the curb, her driver already stepping out to open the door. But before she reached it, a voice called out from behind her. "Ms. Bondi." She turned and found herself facing a small group of people lingering near the theater entrance. Some held programs. Others clutched their phones as if capturing the moment for themselves. But all of them had the same look in their eyes, something between awe and gratitude. One man, a middle-aged gentleman with silver at his temples, stepped forward, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I just wanted to say that what you did tonight was remarkable. I've followed your career for years. I've seen you debate, argue, fight, for what you believe in. But tonight was different. Tonight, you didn't fight. You simply spoke through the music, and it was more powerful than any speech you've ever given." She studied him for a moment, his words settling in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so much of her life in spaces where conviction was measured by volume, by the sharpness of words, by the force of an argument. But here in the hush of the night, she realized that there was a different kind of power, one that came not from assertion, but from vulnerability, from allowing herself to simply be seen. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended, but no less firm. He nodded, stepping back into the small crowd as if understanding. that nothing more needed to be said. She offered them all a final nod before slipping into the back seat of the car. The door closing with a quiet thud, sealing her in a pocket of solitude, as the driver pulled away, the city lights flickering past. In streaks of gold and white, she let her head rest against the cool glass of the window, her mind still replaying the night's events. The way the music had flowed through her like something alive, the way the audience had leaned in their skepticism, melting away into something else, something deeper. She thought of Emma, the young pianist with wonder in her eyes. She thought of the man outside the theater who had seen in her performance something she hadn't even fully grasped herself. She thought of the silence that had hung in the air after the final note, a silence that had spoken louder than any applause. The car slowed as it neared her home, a quiet townhouse nestled in a tree-lined street, away from the noise of downtown. As they pulled up, the driver turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his words carrying weight. "You should do it again, ma'am. Not for them, but for you." She met his gaze in the rearview mirror, seeing in it something honest, something. Knowing, she gave a small nod before stepping out of the car, the night wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. As she climbed the steps to her front door, she paused for a moment, staring at the handle as if on the other side waited something unknown. Then, with a steady breath, she pushed it open, stepping inside where the soft glow of a nearby lamp cast long shadows across the polished floor. She set down her bag, her coat moving on autopilot through the quiet space. But her feet did not take her toward the kitchen or the bedroom. Instead, they led her to, this was where she belonged. The note lingered in the air, dissolving into the stillness of the room. She let her fingers rest lightly on the keys, feeling their familiar coolness beneath her touch, as if the piano itself was exhaling after years of silence. She closed her eyes, breathing in deeply, letting the weight of the night settle around her, letting the echoes of applause, the murmurs of admiration, the quiet understanding of strangers all fade into the background. Here in this moment, none of it mattered here. There were no cameras, no critics, no expectations, just the music waiting to be played. Her hands moved instinctively, falling into a melody, not one from the concert hall, not a practiced piece, but something raw, something unfiltered, something that belonged only to her. The notes poured from her fingertips, weaving together a story that had no words but spoke of every moment of doubt, every moment of perseverance, every part of her journey that had led to this moment. She had spent so much of her life shaping narratives, building arguments, controlling perception, but here there was no need for any of that. Here the music was honest, unguarded. It did not ask for permission. It did not demand justification. It simply existed. She played for herself, not for an audience, not for applause, not for validation, just for the sheer joy of feeling the keys beneath her hands, for the way the music flowed through her like a second heartbeat, for the way it reminded her of who she was before the world had told her who she needed to be. She did not know how long. She played minutes. Hours' time seemed irrelevant, as if it had stretched and folded in on itself, contained entirely within the rise and fall of the melody. But eventually the final note faded into silence, leaving only the soft sound of her own breath and the steady rhythm of her heart. She sat there for a long moment, fingers still resting lightly on the keys, staring at them as if they held answers she had not yet found. And maybe they did. Maybe they always had. Maybe all the years she had spent arguing, fighting, proving herself had been necessary. But maybe she had lost something along the way, and maybe tonight was the beginning of finding it again. A soft vibration from across the room pulled her from her thoughts. Her phone, screen glowing with a flood of notifications, messages, emails, articles, no doubt dissecting her performance headlines, speculating on what it meant, why she had chosen to step onto that stage tonight. But she did not reach for the phone, not yet. Instead, She let her hands fall to her lap, exhaling slowly, the quiet of the room wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. She knew the world would have opinions. It always did tomorrow. The headlines would come, the debates, the discussions, the endless analysis, but tonight belonged to her. Tonight was not about politics or image or proving anything to anyone. Tonight was about the music and the quiet, unshakable truth that no matter what the world said, no matter what came next, she would always find her way back to this, back to the piano, back to the part of herself that had never truly left. And with that certainty settling deep in her chest, she stood slowly, letting her fingers graze the piano one last time before turning away, leaving the room in darkness but carrying the music with her always. And as she walked away, the silence that filled the room was no longer empty but full of the echoes of music, of rediscovery, of a truth she had reclaimed. The world would speak, as it always did, but she no longer needed to listen. She had found her voice, not in debates or defenses, but in the quiet resonance of each note played. And that was enough.